Hello everyone, BigKlingy here to reminisce on 2017. Since this year has been a pretty great one for gaming, I thought I'd do a bit of a special retrospective video here, giving my thoughts and impressions on every game I played for the first time this year. Not all of these games were actually released this year, often I'm a bit late to the party when it comes to finding some gems. And I won't be covering games that I recorded for this channel because all of them were games that I've played before. I'll also only be covering games that I started playing this year. For instance, I technically beat Phoenix Wright's Spirit of Justice and The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 2 in 2017. But since I started both games last year, they won't be included in this wrap-up. Also, I got Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Final Fantasy 15 for Christmas this year, but as I haven't played nearly enough of those games to give an impression on them, they won't be included in this either. Before we begin, I'd like to stress that this is entirely my personal opinion on these games. These are not intended to be reviews or any indication of the game's actual objective quality. These are all just subjective opinions, and let's just say that my opinion on one particularly big game that was released this year is definitely not as glowing as most people's, so just be warned about that. Anyway, let's begin. The first game I played this year is actually an old one, though the fact that a PS3 game can be considered a quote-unquote old game makes me feel old. This is a game that I've wanted to play for a while, but have never really got around to it. So, my sister got it for me for Christmas last year, and I started playing it pretty much right on the new year. The game was Batman Arkham City. At first, this might not sound like the kind of game that you'd think I'd be interested in, but I do like action-adventure games, and the style of the game overall reminded me a lot of the Sly trilogy. Moving around a city, fighting random thugs, your main mode of transportation being a glider, accepting random missions along the way, that kind of stuff. And I'd heard very good things about this game, so I was keen to give it a try. Did it live up to my expectations? Pretty much yes, I absolutely loved this game. The gameplay was great, both exploration and combat, the story was pretty decent, the voice acting is amazing, and there's a lot of stuff to do for an avid completionist like myself. Arkham City itself was a little confusing to navigate at first, and it really doesn't help that there's a giant area in the exact center of the map that for some reason has insurmountable walls, meaning that you have to go around it every time you want to get from one side of the city to the other. But the game gives you a couple of missions to start off with that give you a good idea of where everything is and how to get around. Batman has a lot of gadgets that make mobility pretty fun, and you get even more over the course of the game. I kind of enjoyed the almost Metroidvania style of being able to access more areas the more gadgets you had. Yes, there are annoying Riddler trophies scattered throughout pretty much everywhere, and some of them were kind of annoying to get. I did end up getting all of them, and thankfully they do carry over to New Game Plus, so because I found them all on my first run-through, New Game Plus was pretty hilarious. I could basically do the entire Riddler side quest in one go. It really helps that you can interrogate various Riddler thugs to get the locations of the Riddler trophies marked on your map. I guess on the subject of side quests, that's another thing that I really liked about this game. One of my favorite kind of side quests in games are the ones that actually tell their own little side story. Especially if that side quest has its own individual arc villain who you end up fighting at the end of it in some way. This is pretty much exactly what some of the side quests in Arkham City are like. And while I'd say about 70% of the side quests are great, there are a few side quests that I will say I didn't enjoy all that much. First is Advanced AR Training. Oh boy, that one took me a while. So, you get the basic AR training quite early, and it's one of the missions that helps you get your bearings, figure out how to use Batman's arsenal, especially gliding, and where everything is in the city. The advanced version unlocks immediately after you complete the basic version. Which means that because I'm an obsessive completionist and have to do everything at the earliest opportunity that it's available, I had to put the plot on hold for a while to fly through rings. And man, some of the maneuvers they require you to do for the advanced challenges are absolutely insane. Like doing a huge glide, dropping sharply, then pulling up just as sharply to skim across the surface of water. Ugh. You will have that computerized voice saying augmented reality training failed in your head for so long if you attempt this. The main issue I have with this side quest, I kind of hinted at before. The fact that it's one of the earliest side quests you have available, and yet it's so difficult. You're probably meant to put it off until later in the game, but I just don't like having uncompleted side quests on my map, so I had to do it as early as possible, and that put the plot on hold for ages. The other side quests I didn't like too much were both for the same reasons: Watcher in the Wings and Identity Theft. Both of these side quests require finding something very, very tiny that's hard to notice multiple times that is never marked on your map. Furthermore, more of these things to find keep being added as you progress the main story, but it's never directly indicated when there's something new for you to find in these quests. Unlike the sniper side quest, which directly alerts you whenever a new part of it has begun. In the end, I had to use a guide for both of these. And what's worse is that the only payoff of both side quests is sequel hooks to Arkham Knight that never really went anywhere. There's one other side quest that I had issues with that involves finding a cache of Mr. Freeze's tech. My issue being that that's all there is to it. When I finished this one, I was left thinking, wait a minute, that was classified as a full side quest? Really? Obviously, they just wanted to fill out space in your side quest grid. I touched briefly on the main plot earlier. While I feel that the plot is decent and all the characters and their voice actors are great, it's definitely one of the weaker parts of the game, I feel. It suffers from that classic superhero plot issue of trying to shove way too many villains in one plotline, but it's up to 11 here because they tried to fit pretty much every single major Batman villain into this one. And all of them have their own conflicting agendas. For instance, Two-Face appears in this game, and he's only relevant at the very start of the game, and at the very end of Catwoman's optional DLC. Mr. Freeze is involved, and he has an amazing boss fight, which I'll get to later, but the story justification for that boss fight is incredibly stupid. It relies on both Batman and Mr. Freeze suddenly acting like complete jerks for no reason. The biggest casualty of the plot, though, is Hugo Strange. He's a very unique antagonist, but when you finally get to him, he's taken down very anticlimactically, and his plot is just suddenly swept under the rug to make way for the inevitable Joker climax. I feel like the story would have been more interesting if he and his mysterious benefactor, who I won't mention for spoilers, were the main villains throughout. The Joker plotline is mainly saved by Mark Hamill's voice acting being amazing. It has a pretty decent plot twist. The problem that I have with that, though, is a lot of the foreshadowing for said plot twist is painfully obvious in hindsight, to the point where some of the lines are almost cringeworthy to hear on replays. As for the gameplay, once again I alluded to this earlier, but the boss fights in this game are amazing. Well, at least most of them are. There's a couple that are just glorified mob fights, but the actual full boss battles are all awesome. In particular, Mr. Freeze's boss fight is one of my favourite boss fights in any action game now. Pretty much everyone who's played the game praises that fight, but I'll just briefly describe the premise. It's sort of like a Crash Bandicoot boss in that you have to hit him a certain number of times. The twist is, there are a lot of different ways to damage Mr. Freeze, and every time you use one of them successfully, he'll change the arena or his suit somehow to make sure that trick will never work again. This makes it a pretty fun fight to replay, especially on New Game Plus, where his health is inflated to the point where you have to find almost all of the ways to damage him. Aside from that, the game actually has a very good combat system, though it wasn't until I'd already beaten the game and was playing the Riddler challenges, yes, I did finish all of those by the way, that I learned how it really works. Throughout most of the main story, I was just mashing the attack button and occasionally the dodge or counter button. That's not what you're supposed to do. The combat system is not about button mashing, it's about stringing together actions in almost a rhythmic way. Instead of punch, 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 you have to do it like punch, 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 dodge, counter, punch, punch, stun, jump, dodge, punch, punch. Kind of like that. Once I learned how to use it properly, I finally realized why they call this the free flow combat system, and it actually feels really awesome when you know how to do it right. After learning this, I was able to get really high scores in all of the Riddler combat challenges very easily. And it made New Game Plus a lot more fun now that I actually knew how you were supposed to do the fights. I will say, the Riddler challenges are a little annoying in that there are two sections to them. The single map ones and the campaigns. The campaigns really didn't need to be there. They basically just do the exact same challenges you did before, just strung together in sets of 3 and with restrictions. The worst part about all this is that if you buy any of the DLC characters, you have to do all of the Riddler challenges, including the campaigns, again as them. This is why I haven't bought any of the DLC. But as of now, I've pretty much 100% of the game except for completing New Game Plus and Calendar Man because I think I'm going to just fiddle with the clock to get that one. It's really annoying to have to take an entire real-time year to get one achievement. Even worse when some of the holidays that you have to visit him on don't correspond with their Australian counterparts. Did you know that Australian Father's Day is not in the same month as the American Father's Day? I learned that the hard way playing this game. So anyway, this game overall, I'd actually not hesitate to give it a 5 out of 5 in terms of how much I enjoyed it. It definitely lived up to the hype, although unfortunately I've heard that it's all downhill from here in terms of the series. Asylum is supposed to be quite good, but it's apparently a lot more Metroidvania-like than this one. And Arkham Knight, well, I've watched a lot of it, and the boss fights really went downhill in that game, with a lot of them just being quick-time events, or even worse, just cutscenes. I may be interested in playing Arkham Origins one time. It got a bad rap when it first came out, but I think people have started to warm up to it more now that Knight has come out, and, well, at least Origins had some very good boss fights. So, that's pretty much my thoughts on Batman Arkham City. Now on to the next game. Which I guess, technically speaking, would be Fire Emblem Heroes. Yeah, a lot of you have probably been waiting a very long time for me to give my thoughts on this game, and many of you have wondered why I haven't done videos on this game. There are two main reasons for that. One, I'm not really sure how to record phone footage, and two, this game really doesn't mesh with my informative style of commentary. Reason being, because this game is updated so frequently, any info that I could give would become outdated very quickly. Not only that, but due to the random nature of pools, every individual player's experience with this game is going to be different, because no two players will have access to the same resources as each other. Because of that, I really feel like free units only is the only way to go when it comes to doing informative commentary on this game, and there are plenty of other YouTube channels that already cover that. So that's why I don't intend to record any of this game. But what do I think about it in general? Well, when I first heard the announcement there would be a Fire Emblem mobile game, I was terrified. I wasn't alone in this. I thought that this game could very easily be the death knell of the series if it was done wrong. I have seen tons of horrendous free-to-play mobile games. Ones that just become so exploitative with the microtransactions. And Fire Emblem had plenty of opportunities for that. Pay to resurrect a dead character, for example. There are even people who, half-jokingly, half-seriously, thought this would end up just being the face-petting minigame from Fates. Then I watched the Fire Emblem Direct, and I was pleasantly surprised at what I saw. This was not at all what I expected the Fire Emblem mobile game to be. And on playing it, my thoughts were confirmed. This game did a great job of simplifying the Fire Emblem formula to work on mobiles, with smaller movement ranges and maps, but overall a lot of elements of the game being pretty similar. Different classes, different characters all with their own personality and unique abilities. The weapon triangle, consequences for your characters falling in battle so that you don't just throw people's lives away like they're expendable. In this case, I'm glad that it's just not gaining the experience from that map, because yeah, permadeath in a game with microtransactions would kind of suck. But there are some elements of it that are kind of unique even among the Fire Emblem series. I actually quite like the total RNG-less combats. And the way specials and the skill system are handled have surprising depth to them. Not needing to worry about unlucky crits or misses means the game can ironically be even more strategic than the main series Fire Emblem games sometimes. And some of the skills have unique effects that we haven't really seen in a mainline Fire Emblem game, and I'm kinda hoping some of them make their way into any new games in the series. I mean, it's obviously not perfect, there are some skills that are kind of overpowered, and healing is far less useful in a game that doesn't have permadeath. But I still found it quite an enjoyable game, and that's saying something because this is the first mobile game that I've ever downloaded. I just was not into mobile gaming before. Now, I should also mention that I got this much enjoyment out of this game, and I still, to this day, have not spent a single cent on it. I've operated entirely on free-to-play orbs. Because to me, the mark of a good free-to-play game is one where you can still enjoy it to its fullest even if you don't spend any money. And you never feel like you're really missing out on anything if you're not spending money. I feel like the game gives you plenty of ways to gain orbs without needing to pay. And I'd say the only time that I really felt it dipped into exploitative, encouraging you to pay money territory was the infamous Ira banner. That was really jerkish, but thankfully they learned their lesson and haven't done that again. Or at least, when they did do that, they warned people in advance. Speaking of learning their lesson, another cool thing about this game is how frequently it gets updated, and how the developers seem to be aware of common complaints that players have. Weapons or skills that are underpowered tend to get buffs, and even recently they made staff users a lot better. They keep coming up with new ways to breathe new life into mechanics that were underused before. There's also a surprising amount of depth to the game modes, and they keep adding even more. I didn't find the main storyline to be particularly that great, but I'm hoping that Book 2 will redeem this somewhat. The paralogs are really cool to see references to past games in the series. The training tower definitely got better with updates, and it's a decent way to level up characters. Tempest Trials, they got off to a rocky start, but I quite enjoy them now, especially with the multiplier for your first 2 battles every day. I've never even got anywhere near the highest score though. I tend to stop at about 20,000. The unique special maps they add, like Grand Hero battles and things like that, are also pretty cool, though I've never really come close to beating any of the Infernal maps. I do love how people have found strategies that let you win using entirely free units though. The arena is, it's one of those things like Awakening's Street Pass that I personally feel, what's the point of making a really strong unbeatable team if it's gonna be AI controlled, thus you'll never know if people are having trouble fighting it or not. It's not like it's actually you controlling that team. It falls into my thing of causing suffering to other players at no gain to yourself. Admittedly, there are the defend rewards, but I never found them to be that important. I did the arena quite a lot in the early days of the game, but as they added Tempest Trials and other easier ways to level up characters, I kind of fell out of using it. The only game mode that I'd say I genuinely dislike is the voting gauntlets. I've refused to participate in any of the voting gauntlets since the beginning. I just don't like the idea of just basically encouraging fandom wars. And it only increases the rift in popularity between characters from Awakening and Fates and characters from everything else. I mean, occasionally it gives rise to some funny memes, but arguing characters as being better than others has just never been my thing. I think people should be free to like whichever characters they like. So giving fans of the more popular characters ammunition to go, oh, mine is objectively better than yours, is just a little annoying to me. Not to mention they tried to fix it by adding a rubber banding element, and that made things even worse. I will say though, it took me a very, very long time, this is probably because I'm still free to play, to really amass enough 5-star characters to actually have multiple teams. For the majority of this game's lifetime, I just used Hector, Ephraim, Nino, and Ninian. They were my go-to team for everything. And Nino wasn't even 5-star. It wasn't until much later, when I had more 5-star characters to choose from, that I could actually start planning teams with strategy in mind. Even then though, I'm not really up to grasp with a lot of the game's major mechanics. How to use certain skill combinations, things like that. I wouldn't describe myself as super ultra serious with this game. I just try to get as many orbs as I can with whatever resources that I have access to. Speaking of which, here's one thing that will shock a lot of people. I do not use skill inheritance. I actually refuse to use it on principle. It's for the exact same reason that I refuse to use reclassing in Shadow Dragon. I feel it ruins the point of every character being an individual. Hector and Takumi aren't as unique when everyone under the sun can have distant counter or close counter. So, I treat it as if those skills are locked to them. I fully admit this is just a personal preference thing, and it does make a lot of maps much harder, while also making some characters a lot weaker than they would normally be. For example, if I ever did get Brave Lyn, I'd never be able to give her a Brave Bow. I picked Brave Ike as my free summon from that, by the way. Really, the main reason I play this game is the voice acting, surprisingly enough. The characters from past games that never had voice acting before, I've always pictured in my head what they would sound like. So it's pretty awesome to actually hear them fully voiced. The voice acting can be a little hit and miss sometimes. I feel like some characters are pretty miscast. But there are others who I feel are pretty much perfect. Really, the main reason why I try and pull new characters is just to hear more voice clips. I also find it very surprising that the mobile Fire Emblem game, to me, ended up being more respectful of the series' history than the Warriors crossover. There's just so many neat references to hear in these characters' dialogue. And even the paralogs. When I first played the Genealogy of the Holy War paralog, it was so awesome seeing some lines and thinking, wow, that's exactly from the game! Whereas Warriors, yeah, just a heads up, I did not play Warriors this year. I'm sorry, I have heard that it's a good Warriors game, but I still can't get over the roster, I'm sorry. Mainly because I've wanted a Fire Emblem Warriors game ever since Hyrule Warriors, and yeah, I was hoping for greater diversity in terms of the games represented. But enough about that. Heroes, I'd say, is, well, by default, it's the best mobile game I've ever played, because, well, it's the only mobile game I've ever played. But the fact that it holds that honor when I don't normally play mobile games shows that I still enjoyed it a lot. I wouldn't say it's the best game out there, but it does a decent job of simplifying the Fire Emblem formula for mobiles. So overall, in terms of how much I enjoyed it, you know, I'd say 3 out of 5 initially, 4 out of 5 now. It definitely got better as they added more and more characters. A game that I played, I guess roughly at the same time, would be Dragon Quest VIII on the 3DS. This is a game that I've been wanting to play for a very long time, so once I found out there was going to be a 3DS remake, I was like, okay, I'm definitely waiting for that. So now that I've finally got to play it, what do I think? Well, I don't know, it's kinda alright, I guess. Okay, that sounds a little unenthusiastic, let me just go over it in more detail. Dragon Quest VIII is a very bog-standard turn-based JRPG without all that much unique going for it. You travel from town to town in a fairly generic fantasy world, you have a pretty generic party, and battles are fairly generic turn-based affairs. I understand that it's a little bit unfair to say that because it is a fairly old game at this point, but having played so many JRPGs in my life, they really need something really big and unique to make them stand out to me. The most unique thing about the game's battle system is the tension mechanic, and even that was a little bit weirdly implemented. For the entire first half of the game, tension is absurdly broken. Boss fights pretty much boil down to spam tension until you go Super Saiyan, and yes, the characters literally go Super Saiyan. This was illustrated by Akira Toriyama, after all. And then one-shot the boss. So, most of the early bosses were pathetically easy because of this mechanic. The only one that really wasn't to me was Don Mole, only because he can confuse you. Then you hit the halfway point of the game, and everything gets flipped on its head. From that point on, every boss has a buff-cancelling attack that wipes your entire party of any buffs, including tension. From this point on, I never found building tension to be that worth it, because when these bosses use this attack is random, so you could just spend ages building tension and not doing anything, only to have all your effort go to waste when the boss fires the disruptive wave of energy. There was never any real pattern as to when they'd use this. It felt very random to me, which meant that, from that point on, I never really used tension much. Instead, I just cast oomph on my best physical attacker, and just have them spam regular attacks. I felt like I was doing more net damage over time that way. Magic is also a little bit weird. There are elemental spells, and it seems like there are elemental weaknesses and resistances, but nothing in the game tells you what each enemy is weak or resistant to. Not even the enemy guide after you've fought them. So it mainly just comes down to experimenting with a bunch of spells and seeing which one does the most damage. Healing is also kind of interesting. From the start, your healing is not all that great, but once you start learning the multi-heal spell, it's essential for every boss fight, and once the hero learns omni-heal, you're pretty much set for healing for the entire game. Revival spells are incredibly annoying, because the lowest level revival spell only has a random chance of working. This can be really frustrating when Zing fails 3 times in a row at a crucial moment. Like healing though, once you learn the full revival spell Kazing, which always works, you really don't need to worry for the rest of the game. Especially since one of the 3DS version exclusive characters has a skill that replicates the effect of Kazing for much cheaper. One other mechanic that I wasn't that big a fan of is that, in battle, every character has their own separate item inventory that can only hold about 8 items. In order to use healing items in battle, you had to put the item from your main shared bag into a character's individual inventory, meaning that there were very few healing items you could carry in one fight. And this especially hurt when it comes to MP restoration items. Although later in the game, Jessica and Angelo, your 2 main casters, have so much MP and also gain gradual MP regeneration that they really don't need to worry about ever running out. I guess another somewhat unique aspect of this game is that every character has 5 specific, I guess you could kind of call them skill trees, that you can put points towards whenever you level up. Everyone has 3 trees corresponding to one of the 3 different types of weapons they can equip. Fisticuffs, which everyone has but is apparently useless on everyone except Yangus. And 1 unique passive skill tree that's specific to every character. It's sort of up to you whether you focus on one of the trees extensively or spread your points between multiple, but end up becoming a bit of a master of none. I only found out way too late that certain skill trees for some characters are way better than others, and there are obvious optimal paths for each character that I obviously did not take. For example, I put most of the hero's skill points into boomerangs at the start of the game, because boomerangs hit everything on the field. I later learned that boomerangs are kind of a Jagan weapon. They're really good early on, but not so good later in the game, and that you're supposed to put points into the hero's sword skills. On the opposite end of the scale, I had Angelo roughly focus on swords, staves, and charisma all equally, when apparently his best skill tree is bows. Yangus, I mostly focus on hammers when I think I should have been focusing on axes, I'm not sure. Anyway, one good thing about the 3DS version is, from what I've heard, the original PS2 version didn't actually tell you what you got out of each of the skill trees. In the 3DS version, you can very clearly see which abilities you get from each skill tree. Apparently in the original, you just had to put points into stats you thought were interesting and see what happened. I guess this particularly helps for Jessica because she gets gradual MP regeneration out of her staff skill tree, and that is really, really good to have on her. Outside of the battle system, the game is pretty much just travel from point A to point B, doing things in various towns. The world is kind of big, but there's many areas that there's not much reason to really go there besides maybe 1 or 2 recruitable monsters for the arena. One thing that I didn't like that much about the game is there's kind of a lack of any major concrete side quests. The 3DS version adds Cameron's photography quest, where you have to take photos of various monsters or other things. But other than that, there's really not much reason to return to areas you've previously visited, except when the plot demands you do so. There are a couple of major optional quests, usually involving some kind of optional dungeon, but there are only a few of those in the game, and I think a couple of them are post-game only. Other than that, there's really just the monster arena and the casino, which is laughably easy to rig when it comes to side stuff. The monster arena is kind of annoying because your monsters are entirely AI controlled, so you can easily lose just due to pure luck. Actually finding good monsters for your arena team is a major guide, dang it, because some monsters are vastly better than others in terms of stat progression, and nothing in the game tells you that monsters' stats scale according to your level. Also, one of the 3DS version's exclusive optional party members requires you to complete the entire monster arena, so you want to do it as soon as possible in that version, which is kind of annoying. In the end, I went with the 3 golems. If you find Goldman, Brickman, and Stoneman, they can all combine together into one super golem, which pretty much wrecks most of the arena except the final rounds. Not that anything in the game indicates that they can combine. In terms of the main story, this game is kind of weird. 80% of the time, I'd say, the game does not take itself seriously at all. Everyone you meet has ridiculously over-the-top accents. Almost every location is an exaggerated parody of a typical medieval setting. And the Mrs. Fanservice party member literally has a stat called sex appeal. But the few times where the game does take itself seriously, it gets really, really dark. A whole lot of lovable NPCs are murdered right in front of you, some in really tragic circumstances. The heroes spend the vast majority of the game constantly failing to save anyone and failing at their main quest objective. The actual villain is very dark, and their plan basically amounts to genocide on the bloodline that sealed them away many years ago. There's a minor villain who has a pretty dark backstory and does some very disturbing things to rise to power. And that's not played for laughs at all. It's played like a disturbingly realistic take on medieval power struggles. So overall, I'd call this Mood Whiplash the game. Most of the time, the game is hilarious and pretty much a self-parody, but the few times when it does get serious, it hits really hard. I should mention that I haven't actually beaten the game. I've got up to the final dungeon. I've sort of been playing the game on and off throughout the year because I keep getting distracted by other games. I have heard that there's a big post-game quest that completing it greatly expands the ending. I have been spoiled on the plot twist it reveals, though I do think that plot twist is pretty awesome. I never played the original game, so I can't really comment on much of the 3DS version's changes apart from the 2 unique party members. I do know that it added the ability to have Jessica as a love interest, but I obviously wouldn't go for that because you know me, I like canon pairings. I've heard that a few bits of it was censored from the original version. Apparently the censorship was actually due to the Japanese ratings board, not the English ones. Apparently the kind of stuff you can get away with in a Japanese all-ages game is different then than it was now. I do really like how the 3DS version added some backstory on one of the villains. That moment I thought was pretty cool. My only real complaint about the 3DS version in terms of changes that I know of is that the PS2 version had a fully orchestrated soundtrack, at least apparently only in the international version. The 3DS version just uses the original soundtrack, not the orchestrated version, and I feel like the 3DS should have been able to handle that. I mean, you've got games like Fire Emblem Echoes that have insanely good soundtracks that sound fully orchestrated, so why not this game? So anyway, overall, I'd say I'd give this game, in terms of my personal enjoyment of it, maybe a 3.5 out of 5. I know it feels unfair to call it a fairly generic RPG when Dragon Quest essentially invented the RPG in Japan, but I guess it may be one of those games that probably came across better when it first came out than it does now, at least to me personally.